Hello there and welcome to episode 60 of Right Where You're Sitting Now, the podcast for the site sittingnow.co.uk. Joining me in the hot seat once again this week is Marck Satyr. That's Mark with a C. Welcome, Mark, and how do I find you this week?
Full of anticipation.
Well, and the reason for that is we are interviewing the wonderful, the legendary Tobias Churton, author of many now Aleister Crowley books. I think this is his fifth. His latest book is Aleister Crowley in England, The Return of the Great Beast, but he's written Aleister Crowley in India, Aleister Crowley in Berlin, Aleister Crowley in America, as well as a more generalised biography of the man. But on top of that, I mean, Tobias Churton is a fairly prolific author, wouldn't you say, Mark?
Oh, absolutely, and one of great lucidity, and he's capable of bringing himself to revisit sort of subjects, that not just this subject, but other subjects in the canon, the sort of esoteric canon, and bringing a new light, new sort of insight, and a very kind of penetrating examination. He's excellent at sort of it was almost like a forensic sort of approach of sort of opening things up and then sort of methodically sort of working through them, which actually makes his writing very relative, very deep, and brings a great thoughtfulness to it.
Yeah, so before we go into that interview, I always forget, and then I remember just now. Do check us out on social media. It's starting to pick up a bit now, which is good to see. So it's always Sitting Now. So one word, Sitting Now. If you look us up on Instagram, I think Facebook. No, Facebook, it's Right Where You're Sitting Now. YouTube, it's definitely Sitting Now. But do join us and give us suggestions or things you don't like. Maybe you find Mark abhorrent and you want to get rid of him.
Really, I mean, I can't be expected to work under these conditions. Everyone know, you should be on your hands and knees, Ken, and thanking God that you've got the greatest co-host in the whole of podcast history next to you. So, it's just, that's just a simple fact. Let's just leave it at that. We don't have to go over it all the time, but we know. The people in podcast land, they listen to this. They know this.
Okay, well,
it's a fact of nature. It's like gravity or something like that. It's just just a thing.
Okay, well, I'll leave that subject. That's obviously I've touched a nerve. Anyway, let's go into what I hope to be a fantastic interview with Mr. Tobias Churton. Tobias Churton, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Could you tell us, how did you kind of become interested in the subject of the esoteric and occultism in general?
A certain dissatisfaction growing up in the 1970s, in my teenage years, with conventional religion and an inner sense of poetic transcendence, led me to be sympathetic to things that seem magical or extraordinary. And also, having my teen years in the 70s, there was a continual barrage of everything from UFOs to spoon bending to the chariots of the gods. There was all this stuff. I mean, I thought a lot of it was rubbish, but at the same time, a certain amount of it captured my imagination, possibly from being too addicted to Tintin books. But really, it was the religious component of the magical tradition that attracted me. And when I went to Oxford to study theology with the idea of becoming a priest, I found that I got more inner reward from reading about magic than I did from reading the epistles of St. Paul, which seemed to me to be relatively prosaic. And while inspiring at certain levels, it seemed to me the focus of religion on moral righteousness was adequate, but only a beginning. That was the feeling I had. And I was more interested in all this idea of the mind as a mystery, and above all, that the imagination is a key component of human reality, and that it's suppressed in a strange way. The other thing was that I was profoundly suspicious of governing bodies. That wasn't difficult growing up in Britain in the 70s, because we were surrounded by demagogues of incredible lunacy in the trades union movement, and in all the political parties that I could see were advocating the most extraordinary nonsense about what human life should be about and how to please the ordinary person. I felt very close to people. I had an immense amount of love for them, and I felt they were being shortchanged either with materialistic promises of more of this, more of that, a kind of continual social bribe to conform, or the revolutionary type who seemed to think that we're all just grist to the mill of some sort of abstract revolution to produce an eventual utopia cut to the shape of their infantile or adolescent minds. And we're still very much in that position in England. So I wanted to transcend that. I also wanted to transcend time, because I saw that the agony of man is being compressed into a short, very short existence, never really waking up in the whole time, a bit like finding you're in a swimming pool, but you're sinking all the time. And you know that above the waves is this golden sun, but you can't reach it. It's just a sort of fading and glittering image. And if you lived in the water, you would never be sure if it was real. So an urge for transcendence of time, of myself, of the political, horror of England in the 70s, and of course subsequently, all of that leads one to a realization that there's more to it than meets the eye, as John Lennon was always reminding us. You remember his lovely phrase, reality leaves a lot to the imagination. Yeah, so I was interested in poetry, I was interested in mountaineering, I was interested in going further. All of those things made certain aspects of the magical and esoteric tradition a bit of a harbour, a haven for my ship.
So how was that received at your university? Was it
horror?
Yeah.
Horror, despair, get him out, you know. They thought that the chaplain at Brasenose College really made efforts to see me out, especially when he heard that I was interested in Aleister Crowley, who clearly was the devil incarnate. And then he'd taken me in on the basis that I would turn out to be a kind of combination of evangelical Catholic priest advocating the values entirely of the Oxford movement. And I was just a growing mind. I wanted to do other things. I was interested in this challenge that magic presents and has always presented to authoritarian structures, whether it's science or religion. I had a distinct sense and confidence when I was growing up that there wasn't anything I couldn't master if I wanted to. So I was never impressed terribly by the kind of education that the state was providing. Transcendence is the theme of my whole life, and I want people to transcend.
And were you in any way a practitioner of any of the magical practices, or was it?
I think Crowley would say that every artist is a magician.
Mm-hmm. True. But I mean, did you?
It do mean I draw circles on the floor?
Mm-hmm.
No, but I draw circles around aspects of my work, and I certainly evoke and invoke powers of the mind.
You sort of began an interest in Crowley. How did that kind of come about? Was that because you were a fan of poetry and mountaineering, or was it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was part of, I tell you what it was. I think in my first term, I went to a meeting of the Oxford Mountaineering Society, and in the course of the meeting, somebody who I was speaking to, I'd just come back from the Alps. I've been climbing around Chamonix and over into Switzerland, over that whole range of the Aiguille Rouge and over to Courmayeur. And nothing spectacular. I wasn't a budding Chris Bonington, but I was keen to climb. And I went to this meeting, and somebody started talking about this guy, Aleister Crowley, who had remarkable successes. I mean, we know that he climbed the Eiger single-handed in about 1895, 96, and alone as ever, the Wanderer of the Waste. And he was a remarkable climber. But what intrigued me was somebody said, he was a big hero of Chris Bonington, and that he was a poet, and that a magician. Oh, climbing, poetry, magician. You've covered body, soul, and spirit. Well, that was something. And I must have mentioned him to my great and closest friend, George Simey, who we sort of powelled up in the first term. He, like me, was a bit of a reprobate, and came from the Midlands also. He was from Wolverhampton. I was from Sutton Coldfield. So we knew we had a lot in common just in that. And we were both sort of dissatisfied with conventional thinking and lifestyles. And he had the Confessions of Aleister Crowley from the Wolverhampton Public Library. I'm amazed they let it out, because in Sutton they didn't let Crowley's books out of the library. And he lent it to me after he finished with it. I don't know if he read the whole thing. I read it that Christmas, 78, and I just loved it. I loved his humor, his arrogance, but the non-stop confidence that he had in his own mystical experience. And a lot of it I didn't understand, because there's all that Masonic, quasi-Masonic, Golden Dawn, these extraordinary titles that they were giving each other. That was all a bit foreign and remote. But what came through was a very clear idea of the value of the mystical and the magical combined, as well as the general challenge and his penetrating forensic insight into human hypocrisy and repression. I felt that very strongly grow. I'd done 7 years at a state school called Comprehensive. The headmaster was a bit more interesting than Shirley Williams, and he interpreted Comprehensive in his own sweet way. So it was quite a creative school, but at the same time, we were getting the diet that the Butler Education Act thought we should get. And there was a sort of a general underlying attack on the individual, i.e. conformity, level down. There was a sort of aspect all the time that if you shone as an individual too much, you had to be slightly repressed, otherwise the other people would suffer. So they certainly weren't interested in genius. They weren't trying to cultivate genius. They were very happy to, if they had like today, if they get an Ofsted report, they really think it's tremendous. They bandy words like excellence around, like pepper and salt. Everything's excellent if they decide it is. I'm talking about the structures, and people are persuaded very early. Now, I was very lucky because my father was a real independent mind with enormous experience of a whole range of social situations, and was also working in a factory. So I was seeing society from the bottom up anyway. And he used to say to me, Toby, it's not what you do at school that bothers me, it's what you're doing at home. He didn't just mean how I behaved. What he meant was, he said, this education you get outside is all right, but that won't make the difference. You've got to go further. So he bought me a lot of, he wouldn't read anything published after 1900, and I was pretty much the same. So I started to build up a library about the age of. I wrote the first history of the world. I wrote when I was 11 on a typewriter. Teachers at the school were aghast and jealous, and some liked it, some thought that bloody Churton. There was all that going on. So yeah, it all comes out of a struggle with a system, and it was the English system of that period. Now, I could imagine somebody saying at the time, well, he should be bloody grateful. If it had been 19th century, he'd have been probably straight into a coal mine or something. And I always had that sort of feeling when you listen to Neil Kinnock, if you remember those far off days of the 80s, when the Labour Party were talking about education, the only way to get out of the pit, you see, is to get educated. I mean, you feel that when you read Richard Burton's fabulous diaries. So while education is a liberation, and I understand that it's a step forward from non-education, the content of it is strictly governed. And it was great to go to Oxford and find out who was governing it. And realize, of course, that these types were really nabobs of the mind who control enormous. Look at our previous prime ministers. What have we got? Boris Johnson, I think, was Balliol. Tony Blair, was it Magdalen, if I remember right? John Major, God knows how he got in. He wasn't an Oxford type. I don't know what type he was. And Margaret Thatcher of Somerville. So, to some people that means it's like an establishment easy road. But to me, the whole thing is just yet another mental formula which is imposed on young people to make them conform. You're bound to get to the question, why do I like Crowley? Because Crowley wasn't, like me, an anti-conformist. Because his devotion to truth, scientific and experiential, was paramount.
And also recognizing those, mind-forged manacles.
Yes.
Some deep and in Crowley's words, something instinctive. There's something in his words that people instinctively, I think.
Yeah, I think he felt a connection with Blake. Blake is clearer on some areas that Crowley was obscure on, but it's all part of the tradition.
I think you've got to also as well with Crowley, you've got to put in the work. You have to work hard. He doesn't make it easy for you, and you've got to work hard with his writings. And,
well, he's a scholar. I think you've got to see that he was a Cambridge scholar, even though he was foolish enough not to take his finals. I say foolish insofar as the establishment would always have that in their back pocket to hold against him. Well, you didn't get a degree, and that's why you that's why you weren't able to earn a living when you ran out of your inheritance. You weren't quite close enough. He had, of course, far more ability than any PhD that I've ever met, and considerably more knowledge and experience. But those little things count, unfortunately. And he once he'd got his inheritance, which was within a year of his what would have been his graduation. I think it went to his head a bit. He thought, now I can live like an aristocrat.
Yeah. And he wasn't tutored, as he says himself, in the sort of day-to-day having to pay for money. He never really had a slippery grasp on the concept of money. He wasn't something
with money, as I was, because you see, Crowley never really wanted money. He didn't. No. He needed it, and he knew he did, and he came up with one project after another to try and make money. He needed it for the practical things, but he wasn't in love with money. He'd much rather wake up in the Algerian desert and get the richness of seeing a sunrise. That was his wealth, that he not only could see it, but it inflamed his spirit, and he was driven to poetry. This is why certain kinds of women loved him so much, because he was a romantic, and he saw nature as a sacrament, and human life only making sense when the human life becomes a sacrament.
Yeah, why do you think, currently it feels like Crowley's more popular than ever at the moment. Why do you think it is we're kind of still talking about Crowley in 2022 now? I've just received the latest issue of the Fortean Times, and there he is on the front cover. He pops up. There's a whole movement online now, this whole new breed of kind of social media Thelemites, or he seems more popular than ever. Why do you feel, even though he seems irredeemable in some people's minds, why is he still so popular and so in our kind of modern optics at the moment?
Well, there's always a certain number of people who are fascinated by the magical, the occult, the mystery, the mystic. He kind of a lot of that coalesces around his projected personality, and obviously, we all know it's cliche to say he got a big lift in the 60s because John Lennon and Jimmy Page, and I think a bit later David Bowie were inspired to some extent, different extents and different ways by him. So there's a kind of counterculture cachet with Crowley that has paid off even though the rock era, the great rock era, is probably gone. It's coming out on reissues, CDs, remixes, and all that sort of stuff. So anyone with a mind who penetrates a bit beyond this surface noise is going to find that Crowley was a significant figure in this post-war eruption of countercultural superconsciousness and this desire to transcend the structures of the existence we were presented with by the post-war settlement. And Crowley is a sort of hero of that, because the first thing you ever read about him was he didn't give a damn about telling it like it is. So he's a hero. He's also a bit of a martyr. I think the more you read about him, you realize that his life was, at certain points, something of a martyrdom. He suffered poverty. He suffered disgrace, a sort of disgrace. He certainly suffered persecution, and there's no doubt that his enemies wished he was dead. Nobody succeeded in destroying him. That's another great thing, is that he was, as he said, perdurabo, I will endure. He did endure to the end. I mean, rattled with problems from addiction to heroin and all the rest of it. But he got to the end, and he was lucid to the end, and he never sold out. I think I call the introduction to the new book, Aleister Crowley in England, that very thing. He never sold out. And we've been encouraged in our culture, certainly, to sell out as quickly as possible on every level. You sell out your teen years, you sell out your ideals, you sell it all out for this or that,
especially in this modern age where, teenagers and kids are kind of being told to kind of worship entrepreneurs and all, this kind of this strange new obsession with business and kind of with
if the only food in the marketplace is cash, then I don't blame any young person for wanting to get the cash right. It doesn't mean that they're not thinking of other things. But the trouble is, as Jesus said, the cares of the world, if you get devoted to the treasures of the world, whatever else was in you, the spiritual potential, gets swallowed up in the process. There aren't many people who can sustain a balance between the necessities of life and the capacity that money has to change one's life and a spiritual life, because unfortunately, there really, for most people, there's an inimical conflict between wealth and the spiritual path. One of them's got to give. That's the thing. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody with wealth can't operate spiritually at all. Crowley probably proves that, although he sacrifices his wealth in a way for the spiritual path, and he was very willing to do so. I think he must have thought that at the end of that, there'd be a kind of supernatural redemption where he'd be kept from the actual misery that being poor can be. But as you find in the new book, there were times in the 30s when he was living in what for him were slums in the Elephant and Castle, with a one-room basement flat with a sixpenny gas meter that he didn't have sixpence for, but he was invited to parties where he hadn't the opportunity to clean his shirt collars or get a decent shirt at all. So he paid a high price for his anti-materialism, but he did pay the price, and he carried on. And eventually, people came round and supported him.
That's a kind of a myth with Crowley, isn't it? That he died in penniless squalor and. No,
he was far from penniless. There was at least, I forget the exact figure. There was at least something like 400 pounds in a suitcase under his bed, which had been sent by his followers in California for the publication of his book Liber Aleph, which he would never have spent on himself. You know,
I think
he was comfortable in his last few years of retirement, and he was only retired for really 2 years, 45 to 47, and he wasn't a sort of retirement. It wasn't a complete retirement. He was also preparing his book Allah, and he was still trying to, his last diary entry, he was sending poetry to Patrick Dickinson at the BBC to be broadcast. So he didn't really stop. He was terribly ill with bronchitis at the end, and his normal doctor, Dr. Charnock, was away, I think, when he desperately needed some heroin to give him a lift over the horrible winter of 1947, and it didn't come about, and it said he cursed the doctor, and the doctor soon died. I think that's one of those journalistic stories.
And I think also another shift, which I've witnessed myself in my own lifespan, is that one of the shifts in Crowley, attitudes towards Crowley, and I use the word attitude with precisely that. It's more of a feeling than an actual an argument or a series of thoughts. Is that in the 90s, there was a whole. We've got access now to his work, his corpus, and and if you were so inclined in the 90s, throughout the 90s, steadily, very good qualities. Often, if you were interested enough to go out and read them, you can actually read the man's words yourself and come to your own decision about if this makes sense to you, or is this a life affirming or vision or philosophy of life is presenting, and you get through his works you get a feel for where he's coming from more than anything else. So,
also, though, I think you've also got to say that most people come to Crowley through people who write very badly about him, and always have. I mean, probably, it was very important in the post-war, after his death in 47, that John Simons wrote his hypercritical, inaccurate, and twisted biography, The Great Beast. However, for all its disparagement of Crowley as a moral character, that probably turned more people onto Crowley anyway. You could write about Crowley being the wickedest man in the world, and there will be people who will sort of think, well, who's they calling the wickedest man in the world? And when they find that he isn't Ted Bundy and responsible for sort of multiple stranglings or something, they find he was actually devoted very much to the mystical and so forth. That surprise keeps them interested. I don't know how many people these days would really take a deep look at his poetry, which he thought it was his major thing at one point. At certain points, he wanted to be a poet, probably more than anything, recognized as a poet. And of course, his poetry was terribly badly timed because it was influenced by Browning and particularly by Swinburne. And that style of poetry, by the 20s, after the First World War, came to be disparaged. And he'd really perfected his meter and his discipline of poetry. But for all that, the new generation of T.S. Eliot, Auden fans, his stuff looked old-fashioned, no matter how interesting its content.
Yeah, and the sort of cultural role that poetry, played in people's day-to-day lives. I mean, people back in the day, they poetry would be something which is far more popular as a sort of a medium, and now it's rare that most people can name 3 poets or actually read. And like you say, exactly like you say, he sort of, he was a Victorian. He was born in the Victorian age, although he was completely out of step with it. He'd
have been an amazing rap artist because he had a great facility for simple rhymes and trenchant perceptions put in simple terms. It would have been terrific to put him in a microphone. I think he'd have shown Kanye West and all these people what they could really do with this facility of spontaneous rhyming. But he was a rhymester. Very rarely do you get the poetry of the sort of intensity of a Verlaine or Rimbaud and this sort of thing. For him, he said poetry is the geyser of the unconscious. But actually, his poetry is very, very disciplined. Though I'm always surprised. I was looking at Oller yesterday, his last collection, which was poems taken from his whole life, which was a kind of way of revisiting the world. And there's some bloody good stuff there, and I don't see why it shouldn't be taught in universities next to the other moderns. He's not a modernist poet, but he's just a remarkable poet, and I don't think it really matters whether you're modernist or romantic or whatever you are. People studying Blake today, aren't they, with great interest? And he's hardly a, what's the word I'm looking for? He's not writing blank verse, So, but of course, Blake's allowed to be a romantic because he's 18th century. But if you do it now, I remember submitting some of my poetry to the English literature don at Brasenose, and he said, "Why have you inverted the adjectives? Vision old as opposed to the old vision." I said, "Because it works, and that's just the way it comes out." "Oh, you can't do that anymore." It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, with the Ola book, which is a sort of biography in poetry, because he writes about, all the poems in it have a little sort of caveat at the bottom saying, "I wrote this in blah blah blah. I wrote this in the birdcage in Brighton," or "I wrote this in whatever." They've got those, so it's like a little biography, and the ones about death and the approach of death are deeply poignant. I found those deeply poignant writings. He's very aware of, he's very mindful, as you would imagine, of his own.
Well, of course, but after 1923, it wouldn't have mattered if he'd written like Coleridge. His image was such that no one was ever going to take him seriously, and the salt was further added in 1934 when the Constable trial, where his work was execrated before a public jury and declared pornographic and obscene and all the rest of it. It wouldn't really matter what he'd done after that. But the beauty is, and your main question was why people today, is truth will out. Quality will out eventually.
Yeah, Crowley often gets the last laugh. I think another stumbling block, sort of lingering with the poetry theme, for people approaching Crowley's poems. I mean, it's become a lazy cliche that all his poems are terrible. But I think that's become a lazy cliche. That becomes a stumbling block in itself. But also, Crowley is deeply steeped in the Kabbalah and other mystical traditions, and often there are allusions to that. In the hymn to Pan, "Devil or God, to me, to me." It's not just a nice rhyming statement. There's an inner meaning which is lost, which is overlooked. And
I remember Gerald York writing to him that you write your work as if everyone has Skeat's etymological dictionary by them and they're prepared to look up every classical reference. And so the modern reader simply, if they don't immediately recognize the meaning, if it doesn't come off the page like a journalistic article, they lose interest. And Crowley was sort of astonished by this. He was astonished to find that John Symonds, for example, his first biographer, was not familiar with the works of Browning. He just couldn't understand it. Nowadays, this man, Crowley, would be described as an intellectual snob and a cultural elitist. Well, he was an intellectual snob, and he was certainly a cultural elitist. He wanted you to join the elite. But in order to do so, you need to refine your mind. He was tumbling into a 20th century where mass circulation newspapers were about to rot the minds of millions. The lowest kinds of characters became dominant in politics, and so on. So he's such an outsider to the world we've grown up in. And I think that's part of the attraction now, is a romantic attraction for a man who's somehow penetrated into our wasteland and seems to know better than our betters. And whether this could manifest as a political movement is hard to say, because we have all these political zealots today who are righteousness obsessed, who want to smash images like the zealots in the English Reformation, who went round the churches smashing every image of a saint, smashing every image that they thought was politically incorrect or religiously incorrect. And we have this same mentality today. They want to cancel or burn or destroy or toss away or impose their idea of right and wrong on everybody else. And this is, I do wish Crowley were physically alive today, because he would be able to, he would cut right through this nonsense. So I think there's a kind of nostalgia for a man who was big enough to take on the loudmouth, half-educated, quarter-educated herdsmen who are constantly given voice by our disgusting and hyper-vocal, interpenetrating, hard-to-miss-out media, who are presenting a universe that doesn't exist. And it's the suspicion that this universe doesn't exist which fuels the relative minority, such as yourselves, to take an interest in a social freak like Aleister Crowley.
So, I mean, on that subject, I was actually interested in your take on, obviously, currently in our current kind of social climate, we have this sort of.
Yes, we do need climate change.
No. I mean, we have groups of people now pushing harder to the left and harder to the right than ever before.
Why is that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not 100% sure why. I think this might be because of a lack of education and a lack of and people having a voice in a way they didn't have before via social media. But do you feel that Crowley might fall victim to this sort of this kind of?
He's already. I'm told that there are some people who think that you can be a Thelemite while cancelling Crowley.
Yeah, it's insane. It's called post Thelema. Apparently,
they can stuff their post.
Yeah.
They're going to be last past the post.
Yeah.
There's no Thelema without Crowley. It's his. Thelema is the projection of Crowley's nature. There's nothing more or less than that, which may have a universal element, i.e. we may all have a bit of this in us. But when people start telling you how you should view the prophet, who themselves are not prophets, who themselves couldn't imagine anything other than, it appears to me, what they've read and what their prejudicial background has led them to. When they criticize a great man who themselves are not great, it's just like throwing beans at a colossus. I find Crowley actually gets bigger the more they do that. Rather like Noah's Ark, they were all saying, "What are you doing building a boat? There's no rain." What a dumb, and all that. And eventually those people are in the water. So, can you let us on board? Yes, I think we there's every kind of folly is being let loose. It is a Pandora's box.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I mean, if you wander down to Parliament Square and look at the statues of the great men and women there, they're not great men and women because they're plaster saints. They're not, they're great women and men due to the fact they're not. They're literally not that.
Greatness is transcending what you what you were born with by the full exercise and courageous exercise of your gifts. That's what makes people great.
Yeah. And being human in the fullest.
To have conformist little minds who've picked up a few nostra in a college under a half-educated lecturer, lecturing about whether this person or that person is not great or not great, or imposing their views on distant past and so forth, is to me just is a risible feature of a culture that has almost lost all compass, encouraged by, as I say, the echoey media who cannot help but give voice to the most stupid persons that you can find.
Yeah, absolutely. And Crowley was, human in the fullest sense of the word. And you were saying earlier about he had a sacramental attitude towards life. I mean, he's one of the few, I'd use the words with hesitation, religious writers who write seriously about, for example, laughter and its spiritual significance and it being a sacrament.
He's closer. Crowley is probably today, spiritually speaking, probably closer to the Pope than he is to any of our leading intellectuals. if I said leading intellectual, and I'm really having trouble trying to think of one who's leading anything, leading what, you know.
Yeah.
No, we're in at the moment we're in an anarchy, but it's a false anarchy, because there are plenty of people who do think, read, and have, you know, and are seeking and finding and all the rest of it. But we have unfortunately we have a new. I mean, the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages ruled through stained glass windows and fairy stories, and the elevation of ideas which were then imposed. The contemporary media plays that role. I went into television in the 80s in the sense that I said, I'm not going to let the devil have all the programs. Maybe I can get something out occasionally that is going against that, and give people a window into the world beyond this super Catholic media we have, who now control, as Jim Morrison said, you know, you're ruled by TV. Yes, but he didn't live to see the iPhone. He didn't live to see social media, which are even more ridden with folly than the conventional journalistic media, which is hard to swallow enough. But we now have everybody thinks every tin pot, half-baked brain is a prophet. So of course they will make comments about someone like Crowley. Crowley's going to eventually, I mean, I'm sure the J'accuse, you know, Crowley will be, they'll try to attack him, but they did in his lifetime. They didn't destroy him, and they won't. Because, you know, lies always defeat themselves.
Yeah. And you soon can distinguish the goats from the sheep, and the level and the quality of the debate, you know, determines that, and an informed, thoughtful point of view. And
I mean, it's tragic that we're talking on a little podcast, you know, to a relatively minor audience, and imagine if this debate was had on, you know, international media. What a different world we would have been living in to even think about that.
Yeah, and I know you've said this yourself, Mr. Churton, that, you know, the media's attitude towards Crowley is sort of at best mockery. A point will come. I do believe a point will come where you know, a more insightful, more engaging, more interesting, a more significant, more you know, approach will arise somewhere. I mean, I've seen changes, like I said, I've seen changes in my lifetime, shifts in attitude in my lifetime.
Right. Do you think these shifts are reflected in the media, or is there just now a gulf between the media mogul and their chosen journalists and sort of the rest of us?
Yeah, it's true. I think maybe the internet certainly seems to have you know, been a little bit more kinder to Crowley, doesn't it, than the mainstream media, it seems. Yes.
And how long will it be that freedom continues?
Yes, well, that's the worry, isn't it? I mean, this is what I was sort of alluding to earlier, that we seem to have this new, I mean, we had it in the 80s, you could say, with the Tories and the kind of conservatism, and now it seems to be we have a new form of censorship starting to roll in with this cancelling everything, and it's kind of worrying. I mean, I do worry that Crowley may fall slightly victim to that, but hopefully not.
He won't be. My view is those people are merely firing arrows at themselves. You know, I presume somewhere in them they must have some capacity for reflection, but it's so long as they're caught up in the noise of the media, they never stay still enough or quiet enough to actually. You remember Crowley's concise compendium of initiatic instruction: sit down, shut up, stop thinking, get out.
Mm-hmm.
I think if people I mean, there was a bit of that in John Lennon's Bed In, you know, he said, what if the leaders of the world stayed in bed for a week? They might get an idea of what peace was actually like. You know, he said the tension would be released. But I suppose you could argue today they're not only, the leaders of the world, not only in bed, but they're probably fast asleep as well.
Well, I think we should probably discuss your new book. It comes out, I believe, in February.
You don't have to.
Oh no,
no, we definitely want to do that. So far, I mean, it doesn't make for a good podcast, but I've agreed every single word you're saying. So, but it does make a good podcast. So let's go. Yeah, let's.
Well, you think I failed to give you what you wanted? I'm sorry.
No.
On the contrary.
So the new book is Aleister Crowley in England. When does it comes out in February, I believe.
In England, it's out in America now, but that's because it's an American publication, so they have to be first, you know.
yeah. And that's Inner Traditions, who kindly sent us copies of the book, and we have a spare book.
That is one wonderful publisher.
Oh, they're brilliant. Yeah, I love dealing with them. They're my favourite publisher so far to deal with. They've been nothing better.
They're the only ones in the world that I can honestly say show an inkling of a memory of when there was a real idealism abroad in the Western world, and it's a remarkable achievement of Ehud Sperling, who used to run a work in bookshops in New York, and then you couldn't run a bookshop in New York because the ground rents were too great, so they moved out. They're fantastic. I've found them more wonderful to deal with than any English publisher, and I've had quite a few English publishers fallen victim to the post-Thatcherite economic model.
And they haven't balked at the proposal of having 5 books on the same subject, when they can see the value.
But I have written 20 others, so I mean.
Well, yeah, I know. Yeah, well, exactly. But they haven't said, oh no, not another book. I mean, some.
That's something I want to very much dispel. What inspired me? One of the major inspirations to write about Crowley in the first place was I read Martin Gilbert's 8-volume biography of Winston Churchill, which I adored, and I read every volume with gathering interest because he's such a wonderful man to read about and to get to know, as opposed to the comic image of your average iconoclast. But I thought, well, Crowley actually, the more material I found, deserved this, and I did a 1-volume version, and it was delayed because of publishing problems in England. And Richard Kaczynski's book came out, Per Durabo, and mine came out afterwards. And I had the horror of people saying, Churton's, I don't know why he's done it. It's not as good as Kaczynski. Well, what they didn't know was I'd had to, in order to get mine out at all, and it'd been delayed something like 3-4 years, in order to do it, I had to cut so much material. And this was material to me was the whole point of the book. So I ended up doing the Aleister Crowley biography book, and it ain't bad, but to me, it wasn't at all what I was imagining. And it took various experiences, and then I was asked to do something for a tour show of Crowley's paintings, and by an Australian, and out of that came the Berlin book, Aleister Crowley in Berlin, because there was nothing in detail about Crowley's Berlin experience, which is incredible in itself. Do you know he was the only English artist between World War I and the Hitler period who was given a solo show in Berlin, when Berlin was the cultural epicenter of the whole world in the late Weimar period? Crowley was the only Englishman they gave a show to. That itself was fascinating, and to describe it. And after that, later, I thought, well, God, the material kept coming in, and I did the America book, which was a revelation to me as much to everyone else. And then it was obvious that India hadn't been covered, so I did the India, and I may have missed one. And then it was obvious that the whole period from when he got out of Germany in 1932, and I mean got out because he was in danger of his life, that period to his death hadn't been covered in anything like the detail that I know people who are genuinely interested in Crowley require, and that includes me. But actually, I thought that would be the end of it. Actually, the England one, but there is one more.
Well, from beyond the grave. I mean, he dies at the end. I mean, it's a bit spoiler alert there.
Yeah, because then you'll have a sort of 6-volume biography of Crowley, which is about, I think, is about right.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow!
And that's how it should always have been. I mean, he's too big, and the material that's available now, and well, was actually available originally, was always too vast to cram into this. I mean, if you actually read the original book that sold so well, The Great Beast by John Simons, if you look at the apportioning of material, the last 30 years of his life really gets very, very, very little notice.
And there's some truly interesting stuff in there. I mean,
it's more than true. Yeah, it's as interesting as any other. I always think the Chefalou period and the whole business of the 2 years with huge gaps between 1920, he was only in Chefalou from what? Summer 20. He was in Paris most of the winter of that year, quite a lot of 21, about half of 22, and a little bit in 23. So it was a fragment of his life, and he was actually in retirement at that point, because he'd so exhausted himself in America between 1914 and 1919 that he actually went to Chefalou to retire. Well, too much stuff about this Abbey of Thelema. It was just his humour. He'd have called, if he was living in a flat in Brixton at the time, he'd have probably called it the Abbey of Thelema. He certainly set up an Abbey of Thelema, or tried to, when he was living down in what's the bloody place?
Oh God, it's where Fawlty Towers is set.
Yeah, exactly. I've got to say, lapsed memory. Torquay,
yes, Torquay, darkest Torquay.
I need to think of Crowley and Torquay in the war years, and of course he was there because of the bombing in London had finally shattered his nerves, and he very, very, very nearly died, and was reported to have died. And there were reporters around his lodgings in Torquay expecting to announce to the world the death of the great beast, but by a miracle he survived, and it was a miracle, because his asthma was exacerbated not by the bombing itself. Funnily enough, when the bombing would happen, it would ease up. It was the not knowing when the next bombing was. And of course, he was living in Richmond for a lot of that time, and they were bombing all right round the waters around there, and the whole house was shaking. You never knew what was going to come. And he was in his 60s, so he was you would say today vulnerable. He was vulnerable, and the wartime story of Crowley is fabulous, and that's very much brought out in the book on a day-to-day basis. I mean, he kept records of every single air raid, every single one, from the exact time, from the air raid warning, and all this. You have this incredible detail of a man who was, and I have a lovely story that Donald Camel's father told about when they see a German bomber shot down, and he ran out into the street in Richmond dancing like a child for joy at it. Such a, that's Crowley was such a, he never stopped being the schoolboy.
Yeah, and an instinctive response. There's no, there's something deeply, there's instinctive and immediate about that response.
He would sing Rule Britannia with the best of them, because he always, in his heart of hearts, he was a spirit. So he had the spirit of the Englishman, the true Englishman who defies, defies expectation. I mean, much as he was very, very keen on the Celtic identity, and his old family, Crowley, of course, was originally Irish, but his branch of the family had been in England since the 1700s. He was hypercritical of the British government, but he certainly was. He never stopped being. Part of him was always a proud Englishman, and there's no doubt of that. And I would like people today to not be ashamed of being part of one of the greatest stories of this thing called human beings on this planet. England has its part to play. To me, it is not a catalogue of endless shame. It is a catalogue of human beings, very often triumphing over goodness knows what obstacles.
Absolutely.
And I'm not one of this righteousness brigade that if people don't wave the flag of Greenpeace and think we're all equal, whatever the hell that means, I mean, there's some people I've met who are quite superior to me in other ways. How can we possibly be equal? And women especially, I think, are in superior that I've met. Some are, there's no equality, of course. You have what if you mean equal before the law? Well, of course, my theft, if I thieve a car, it's probably no different to anybody else thieving one. That's it. But that's not equality. That's not equality. That's the law. Now, if you invoke the law, you destroy everything that's interesting.
Yeah.
Human beings.
Yeah, I mean the cattle in the field are all the same, all equal. That represents a certain type of stultifying sort of.
Crowley's anti-egalitarian. Let's be clear about that, and that's very important. And this idea that egalitarianism is the enlightened principle is just a fiction of the so-called Enlightenment.
Mm. Well, one thing I found particularly interesting about this sort of this period of Crowley's life, and you represent it very well in the book, is his kind of struggle to maintain the Pasadena Lodge in California. He seems to have a very
well, you say he struggled to maintain it. He actually he was as much of a problem to its maintenance as he was an encouragement.
True.
I think he had a bit of a fantasy about what was going on in California, and he desperately wanted to be part of it. And I think he was just terribly frustrated. But that's a very strong theme in the book, is this American side of the story, which was almost non-existent in all the early Crowley stories. Certainly the Great Beast, John Simons, which is still current, paid no attention to Crowley's huge American experience and contacts.
It's a fascinating period. I mean, you've got some really interesting sort of side characters there as well, haven't you? In America, and I was wondering if you could maybe talk about some of the more influential characters, should we say? From
there's obviously Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons came into the Californian Thelema Church, established by Wilfrid Smith, quite late. But his arrival transformed it, as if Douglas Fairbanks arrived. I mean, he was known as Handsome Jack. And he was a striking young man, and he'd already got a freewheeling morality and wanted to go to bed with practically every girl that took his fancy, and did. He was a rocket specialist. I believe there's a crater on the moon named after him.
On the dark side.
Yeah, exactly. He was kind of well ahead of his time. He got his own sort of Wiccan concept of woman before even Gerald Gardner had even met Crowley and cobbled together his Wiccan revolution, if you may call it that, because it has been hugely influential. But he had this idea of a completely liberated woman. And he's writing in, late 30s, early 40s. Fascinating character, but he went over the top, of course, as so many people do with Crowley, or whether it was the drugs, the sex, or what, I don't know. Crowley was terribly worried about what was going on in Los Angeles. He said, the last thing I want Thelema associated with is that sort of disgusting, dribbly thing, the love cult. But there were wonderful characters turned up at the two main addresses of the Thelema Church in California. Some of the women were very, very striking. Jane Wolfe, of course, was out there. She'd been with Paris, and she'd been with Crowley in Sheffield and later in Paris. And she was a movie actress. You can see her on YouTube in various silent films. And her career was ruined by her association with Crowley. She couldn't get any work in the late 30s and 40s because she was a devotee of the Thelema Lodge or church. They called it both. And but she also is a great personality, and many of her friends. They're remarkable. Martin Starr's written a book called The Unknown God about the Californian Thelemites. My own view of that book is that it has a great deal of cynical disapprobation about it, much of which is deserved, I think, on balance. But I think also, if like me you love extraordinary personalities, I think it rather undersells what was going on there.
Yeah.
But I think Wilfred Smith was a heck of a character. He's a very prosaic, ordinary fellow working for the Californian Gas Company, and yet he's trying to lead a spiritual revolution based on the telegrams and letters he gets from Uncle Alistair, as it were, who was existing in various states of penury in a bombed-out London. I mean, it's an incredible story that this development was going on while England was in peril of its future altogether. No question. And then the wonderful arrival of Grady McMurtry, Grady Louis McMurtry, who comes over. He'd been at he'd been to some of the meetings at the Thelema Church, was very impressed by the Gnostic Mass. And he comes over with the American army just before the Battle of the Bulge. There was on TV the other night, very good sort of movie recreation of it. And he went out with the American army, and Crowley wanted him to lead the whole thing after his death. He said, you're the one. You've got to be blooded to lead Thelema. We want men who've actually faced the real conditions. I mean, he was quite amazing, McMurtry.
Yeah.
A remarkable character, poet. And then later, incredibly, after fighting in the Korean War, distinguishing himself in active service after D-Day, in fighting the SS and the Germans and all the rest of it, up to the collapse of Berlin in 1945, and he's then in the Korean War, and then boom, fast forward to the 70s, and he becomes frankly a hippie because he wants to meet and relate to young people, and some experiences with LSD, and he starts to grow his beard, and he looks like a Sufi mystic. Much missed, Grady McMurtry, remarkable wit and incredible intelligence. And you can hear things on the internet of him talking about Crowley, and he talks incredible fast like that. It's really you got to keep up with the guy. Incredible mind, wonderful. And he's responsible really for revitalizing the OTO, without which a lot of the books you imply have been produced, in the last 20, 30 years, wouldn't have come about. Because Crowley, certainly when I first encountered Crowley, the only things you could get were a couple of books from Routledge, and the rest was pirated versions with very poor quality indeed. And that certainly changed. Yes. I think personally Crowley's going to tower as he believed he would. I think in due course, unless we are wiped out of existence by some horror or other, I think Crowley will triumph over this era, and all the naysayers and the anti-spiritualists and the scientismists who believe, if you can't put it under a microscope, it doesn't exist, and all of that, they will be the footnotes and the endnotes of history. And if there is any chance at all, and I'm not at all optimistic, but if there's any chance at all of a spiritual revival of humanity in our fullness, Crowley will be one of the patron saints, regardless of his personal predilections and follies and countless failures of which he was the first to admit.
Regardless, or because I think as well, and sort of stepping back to Grady McMurtry, my understanding is that, as a magical operation, as an act of magic, he wanted to revive the vehicles and systems that Crowley, was striving for in his lifetime. And yes, like you say, that's an important part of the legacy.
He is, and I think you'll find these people who go on about cancelling Crowley just don't know any of this stuff. They've read a bit, they've realised that he's a Tory, high Tory, and probably don't understand the difference between a high Tory and any of the current front bench of pseudo-Tories. Crowley's a high Tory, and he's not a socialist. That's the fact. But that doesn't mean that he's not dedicated to the liberation of all living people.
Absolutely. Every man and woman is a star.
Every man and every woman is a star.
There you go. Excellent. I mean, we should let's cover a couple of other before we let you go. Let's cover a couple of other important periods that you cover in the book. I think one of the most important ones, especially for Crowley himself, would have been his work with Lady Frida Harris.
Oh, yes. Lady Harris is the proper word. It's Frida Lady Harris.
Oh, Frida Lady Harris. Yeah, that's right. Sorry. Could you talk to his relationship with Harris, and also the work they did together, and the wonderful art work that came about because of this relationship?
Frida, yeah, well, I mean, I go into that in the book, and I don't want to spoil the fun of the book by spilling all the beans of how they actually met and what their existing connections were. I'll just say this. I think that one of the greatest meetings of Crowley's life turned out to be, it started on a very low key at an invitation to a dinner, a mutual friend, Clifford Bax, if I remember right. Crowley, this was when Crowley was living in sort of Elephant and Castle and could hardly find a clean shirt to wear. And they met, and he must have looked pretty wrecked at the time, I would have thought. But she was a woman of great insight and spiritual vision. She was into Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, and something between them clicked. And Crowley had to ask himself, is this a woman I'm going to go to bed with, or is this something else going on here? He wisely came to the conclusion this was something else was going on here. And they started to meet. And I think his initial thing was, here's a soft touch for some money. She could, pay my bills, etc., etc. Anyway, she gave him short shrift on that one. She was married to the chief whip of the Liberal Party, Sir Percy Harris, who was a member of the Queen's Privy Council and had access to all kinds of government papers and this sort of thing. It was a serious, although dull, they said no one could empty the House of Commons quicker than Sir Percy Harris. But he was a kindly man, and he believed in his wife's, who was much younger than him, he believed in his wife Frida's artistry. And she hadn't had any serious recognition as an artist. And through their conversations about art and its relationship to the spirit, and they are wonderful, the letters between them, because Frida was no pushover. She was extremely, she would say to Crowley, I don't know what you're talking about. You're talking absolute nonsense. This is not the way I see it. I see it like this. And Crowley realized he got himself mixed up with the mind, with an excellent intuitive mind and a truly creative artist. And he chose her to be the artist executant of his plan to do a completely new set of the 78 cards of the tarot. And that relationship goes on the working relationship goes on from about 1938 to 1943. And she would pay him a stipend, as she called it, out of her own money. And she went without, so she could give him money, just so he could get by. And Crowley was terribly generous when he had money in his pocket. He was down to the Café Royal and would buy drinks for everybody. So it was a hell of a burden. And she had to constantly tell him, look, I want to see you alive. I want to see you being able to pay your rent and put sixpence in the gas thing and make the odd phone call. But I'm not here to fund your lifestyle. And he respected that. They had a big falling out because of Crowley's reputation. When she finally finished these marvelous paintings, which I've seen at the Warburg Institute, I mean, they're about over 2 feet tall. They're very big. They're not the size of a tarot, of a normal card. They're actually paintings framed, which were then much later and not in Crowley's lifetime. The whole set was eventually photographed, and it took decades for this incredible achievement to come out. But she originally had them exhibited in three places. Oxford, I remember the gallery, when they found out Crowley was connected, cancelled the exhibition. She found that in London she could only exhibit them by keeping Crowley out of it altogether, which was, he'd written the original catalogue essay, and she got Robert Cecil, who was a friend of Crowley, in fact, who was a pupil of Crowley, who was working with the head of MI6 at the time. She got him to write the new foreword for the main exhibition at the Berkeley Galleries in London in 1943. And she didn't even mention Crowley in it. She said, I'm very grateful to a gentleman who spent his life studying the mystical Kabbalah and its relationship to the tarot. So Crowley was profoundly hurt that what he'd spent years with the meetings discussing every single aspect of every single card, what to include in it, because she did many tests, which I've seen also her drawings and sketches that you don't normally see, and it was a huge evolution to produce this fabulous pack. And he produced the Book of Thoth out of this, which was published in 1944 as a magazine. This was due to the government saying you can't produce books because of the paper restrictions under the wartime conditions. A bit like today, the government steps in with yet another set of restrictions. So it was published as a magazine, but actually it's a beautifully bound book, the Book of Thoth. Very few people have seen the original. There's an American paperback version, which is a reproduction, but not a very good one. The pictures are in black and white. The original plates are absolutely gorgeous, and there's only a selection of some of the dominant cards. And that was just one of his projects that kept him going. But their relationship, I think, was profound. She was devoted to him after he died. She visited him on his deathbed, and she never, even though they had this falling out over the exhibition, they became firm friends again. Crowley was always very forgiving. This is another aspect. He could be very vicious if people didn't come back. If people did him a disservice and disappeared, they were out. But he when he recognized the true circumstances of a person and their genuine willingness to get behind the deeper thing, he realized that there wasn't any chance that Aleister Crowley was going to be publicly recognized as an artistic contributor in London in 1943. It just wasn't going to happen.
No.
His reputation was utterly destroyed by then.
I was browsing the internet recently. My partner and I, Christina, members of the National Trust, and we were looking for places to visit, and I sort of stumbled upon this place called Tredegar House.
Oh yes, yes.
And a big spread and National Trust website all about Crowley, and I thought, oh my god, there are two things I never consider being kind of connected, and there's this character called Evan
Morgan.
Yeah, so he was known, according to the National Trust website at least, is known as the Black Monk. And Crowley apparently described him as the adept of adepts. I'm looking at the website right now. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about Evan Morgan, because he's an interesting character as well. And Crowley did seem to have some respect for him.
Well, he had Evan Morgan, Lord Tredegar, had a magic room at his place at Tredegar House, which Crowley, when he visited, he spent a long weekend there. I think Evan wanted him to perform some magic, and I don't think Evan Morgan was terribly worried whether it was black, white, or grey, or anything. Just could he do some? Crowley was very nervous that he was going to be inculcated in some sort of magical experiment of Tredegar, who he'd met at the Café Royal and other places in London, and he was a bit nervous about it, what he might be asked to do. Because Crowley didn't like this sort of idea of being set up for, to demonstrate what he could do. I mean, Morgan's an interesting guy. I mean, he was working for MI8 in signals intelligence in 1942 under MI6, but he'd blown it by being too loose with his speech with a couple of local girls, which had been reported, and he lost that job. Crowley was always at this period in the 40s on partly on the fringes, partly on the inside of certain figures in MI5 and MI6, some of which he didn't realize he didn't even know how actual senior they were. So, I mean, Crowley was always somewhat naive about people in this sense. He was sort of a bit of a, I suppose you can call him an intelligence asset at the time. Well, that gives you an idea. Second Viscount Tredegar, he introduced Crowley to some remarkable ladies, including the wife of the Chinese ambassador, Madame Wellington Koo, and she visited Crowley at Hastings after the war. But she'd been told things like Crowley could make it rain on a particular part of a road if he wanted to, that sort of magic, the kind of Harry Potter type of idea of magic as being extraordinary interventions or miraculous moments in the natural order, whereas Crowley never conceived of magic as interventions in a natural order, because he saw no lack. There was a continuum in nature, and occult knowledge was simply understanding how that might work and its relationship to the mind. But they came looking for miracles, and when he couldn't provide them, they were very disappointed, and they noticed that he was old and he was living in relative simple circumstances. So Madame Wellington Koo felt she'd been rather been slightly misled by Lord Tredegar, but it was Lord Tredegar recognised that Crowley's glory was within him, not in his circumstances. And I think it took some courage, as we were talking about Frida Harris, to see the real Crowley behind the battered old man of the 40s and late 30s. That took some courage. We don't have that problem now, because we're not presented with the ravages of a life perhaps too well lived. We can see Crowley in the round. That's why I've done the biography, to show the fullness of this man and the way he touched so many people, remarkable people, and continues to do so.
Would you say it's fair to say Crowley felt that he was a prisoner of England towards the end of his life? In this.
Yes, I think Crowley, of course, was no prisoner of anybody, and I think if he'd ever felt that bad, he'd have swum the channel. Because Crowley was not a person who acquiesced, but his great effort was to try and get a visa to go back to America. Now, he knew America incredibly well. He'd lived there non-stop from November 1914 right through to November 1919. He had followers there. He had all kinds of opportunities that would have arisen had he been able to get back. But he couldn't, try as he might, with the highest help available. The way he would put it to his friend in America, Carl Germer, his eventual successor, he says, Britain's war effort needs me so much that they won't let me out. Now, how much of the inability to get a visa was due to his reputation? How much might have been due to the pressure of J. Edgar Hoover on the American side regarding him as undesirable? We don't really know. Though it came very close. And I think by the time it became a real possibility, which was 1946, he was too ill to make the journey. And they all desperately wanted to see him over in Los Angeles. And he said basically he had to have regular heroin to stave off these crippling bronchial asthmatic attacks, which eventually did kill him, which had started, started getting truly bad in the 20s, through the anxieties of his life mainly. He was constantly living like a gypsy, and he suffered enormous anxiety. The real damage started. I mean, he always called it Kangchenjunga phobia, meaning the interruption in his nervous system. He associated with the 1905 attempt on Kangchenjunga on the Nepal-Sikkim border. But while that probably initiated the first asthma symptoms, it got really bad, started to get really bad in America, because he had literally no money. He was living in the most difficult circumstances, and was very lucky to survive it. I mean, you read Crowley in America, you'll see what a hell he went through, trying to live in New Orleans and then in garrets and sleeping on people's floors and benches in various parts of lower Manhattan. And he really went through it. And that anxiety over his ability to live didn't ease really until he met Lady Harris, who gave him a few years where he had what we now call supplementary benefit, just enough to keep starvation at bay.
And of course, at this period, he ended up in Netherwood in Hastings. And
I don't like that phrase, ended up. He chose. He chose. He didn't end up there. He chose it. It was brought to him as an idea by his dear friend Louis Wilkinson's son.
Mm.
Louis Wilkinson he'd known since first in 1912 and got to know him in America because Louis Wilkinson was lecturing on English literature on the east coast of America during the First World War. And they re-met up. Wilkinson had been a correspondent of Oscar Wilde and was very fond of Wilde. And like Crowley's lover, Ada Leveson, supported Wilde when the whole world turned against him. Crowley was very sympathetic to Wilde on one level, but always rather felt he'd rather asked for it. But he nevertheless, of course, Crowley was, of course, as equally at great risk from the kind of forces which Oscar Wilde had been through, because Crowley was bisexual, and it would only have taken, we know that his reputation starts to go down in 1910 when he is accused by implication in the Looking Glass of having sexual relations with men in the Golden Dawn period. And that's really when he becomes vulnerable to the kind of blackmailing techniques of the British yellow press, which I'm sure all that still goes on. The persecution of a vulnerable individual by the press when it suits them.
Absolutely, and also, the John Ball newspaper articles. I mean, the man we would love to hang is being
that was John Ball.
yeah. I mean, on the same page, they castigate D.H. Lawrence as a perverted monster for similar reasons.
Yes, and isn't it sad that Lawrence, of course, had no time for Crowley. Interestingly enough, he thought he was old hat. Well, sod you, D.H. Lawrence, is what I'd say. Without his old hat, you wouldn't have any new trousers. That's my view. But no, absolutely. In the memory of the British establishment of literature, you can be execrated for any sin. If you're Percy Bysshe Shelley or D.H. Lawrence, you will be rehabilitated. But Crowley the mud must stick. Why is this? And this is one of the great questions. Why is Crowley? While he may have a following, that following, I suspect, will probably stay fairly niche. We may be an influential niche. Who knows? And in spiritual terms, it really doesn't matter. But I can't imagine a time in the future when 20th century English literature has a Crowley component. But I may be wrong. But I found with the subject that I've made my own, as it were, Western esotericism, we managed to get a course going in Exeter, which a lot of people in the university were against. I say a lot of people, some figures were against it. And I would love to get a Western esotericism course in Oxford, but I think it's pie in the sky and very unlikely in my lifetime because of the whole field of magic is seen as basically a pointless and misleading and superstitious nonsense. Even though the English are still very much, not only the English, goodness me, people around the world want to know about it. Yeah, and it's one of the sad things, really, is when a culture closes its mind.
I mean, like I was saying earlier, I mean, I remain sort of optimistic because I've been in the sense that I've been surprised. I've seen the shifts in my own lifetime. I've seen things where I'd never thought would be possible in those changes of cultural attitudes.
Well, I've been part of that. And
absolutely.
The fact that I was able to teach MA students. I know I'm not as pessimistic, and it's one of those difficult things. I can't possibly predict the future. I do feel that the woke PC brigade will eventually shout themselves out. They will be, left hoarse with indignation, but the world doesn't change, and that they may well pass on. My feeling is the brightest sparks of the world today, they may not be the noisiest or the most publicized, are very much sensitive to the best of that. I was going to say the 60s, and I mean that quite specifically, philosophical counterculture, but without the dogmatic, aspects which have cheapened it. But I think the only hope for mankind is, as Salvador Dali said, is genius, individuality. It's the individual that's going to save us. And by that, I would like that to be every individual coming out, refusing to stand in line and salute the sergeant of the law, by which I'm not advocating public anarchy, but an intellectual freedom, but which relies entirely on spiritual freedom. Man is a spiritual being, as Kathleen Raine never tired of reminding me. Man is a spiritual being in a spiritual universe. This isn't something that contemporary science recognizes explicitly. Though the more I hear about physics today, it's very difficult to think of its material at all. When we have to engage with concepts of charm and strangeness, these seem to me to be talismanic, magical conceptions. Obviously, I just think we've got enormous way to go. Crowley was a pioneer. He wasn't finishing the job. I think he was starting it. As for people who cancel him, well, you could cancel Galileo, cancel Giordano Bruno, cancel Isaac Newton. They also were freaks in their time to some minds. Cancel Pico della Mirandola, who else don't you like? Don't you, when you've got your Inquisition together, your public Inquisition with your little phones, with your cowardly trolling of individuals, your interference with other people's true will, what are you going to do when the means of that are taken away? You're going to found your new Inquisition? Are you going to turn political parties into inquisitors into people's private business because you don't like it? You don't like what they write, think, say, etc., etc.? What kind of mollusk are we breeding in this body politic of ours? No, I think Crowley is very important in this stage of our development, simply because of this blessed and vital freedom, which we must not only cherish but assert and build on.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Tobias. Could you let us know what you have coming up in the pipeline? Obviously, you have this book that is yet to land in England, but is currently out, Aleister Crowley in England, The Return of the Great Beast. But what else can we expect from you in the near future?
You say you're never satisfied. Well, I carry on, well, there's all sorts of things. My next book, the next book that will come out, that you will be available, is, I'm slightly loath to say it, because with the new one coming out, I'll wait till the next one. There is one more Crowley biography to come out, which I have finished, and which we'll be preparing over next year, amongst other things. I'm now engaged on a book that will come out after that one, which I will start, today really, which is about the origin of alchemy, real origins of alchemy. A lot of things are said about alchemy. A lot of it is second, hearsay or things people have read. I want to get down to the absolute sources, nitty-gritty of the origins of this whole notion of a transformative chemistry, and where it comes from and what was originally intended, as far as we can possibly say. The greatest collection of alchemical writings that were discovered in Egypt have never been translated in their entirety into English. You may amaze people who think it all happens here. It doesn't. It was only translated by the Frenchman Berthelot. I remember trying to get Berthelot's compendium of Greek alchemy. They're called Greek, and we're talking Greco-Egyptian. I remember trying to get it at Oxford, and you couldn't get a copy of the thing in French, never mind. And there is no English, so I've set myself to translate that, which is enormous work in itself. But I did that with the Occult Paris book I did, where I had to translate practically everything, because there was no English interest in it. And this, I found the stuff I was translating was of enormous vitality and cultural significance, use that phrase, but nobody bothered translating it. So in order to get the picture of alchemy accurately, I will be going to work on that material. So that's my immediately next project. Then there's another book coming out. The last volume of the Crowley biography will come out in 2020. Well, it'll be 23, won't it? 23, all being well. Other than that, I carry on with my music, and I'm hoping to. I've written some drama scripts and all. One always has these projects going. Very difficult. Hollywood is very difficult territory at the moment. Company I've been dealing with has got some like 19 delayed projects due to the COVID.
Tell me about it. I work in that industry, so yeah, everything's delayed in that world.
It's hopeless. I mean, this whole thing we've been through is just hysterical, really. Just hysterical. I mean, there must be something about spreading of disease that sets off kind of medieval levels of mentality, of hyper fear and mythological thinking, inability to get to grips with the facts and all the rest of it. And one of the nice things about being an old Oxford person was they do send you information of research that's being done. And one of the things I was really glad to get was we got regular updates on the development of the AstraZeneca last year, and the work that the people were doing, and the tireless work to try and get this flipping vaccine made. It was so inspiring, and they were really giving it all for the sake of human beings' life and the civilization. And to hear people treat it as if it's like a bowl of cornflakes that they could refuse, it really is. If you ever wanted any faith in mankind, my own view in this is we've finally discovered exactly what proportion of the country are completely stupid.
Yeah,
you can actually measure it by the people who have been so blind to reason on this one. Reason is a gift of the spirit, and all this spiritual interest is important, but the fruit of it should be a true sense of reason. You can't subject spiritual values to rational analysis and exhaust them, because spirit comes first, reason comes second in the initiated tradition. But when you've got reason supported by a spiritual effort, if you can't see it, you're neither rational nor spiritual.
Indeed, exactly, and that's a great way to end this episode. But thank you so much, Tobias, for joining us. And I definitely want you to come back on actually in the near future, because we would love to talk to you about Gnosticism as well at some point, which I believe is a subject you're well acquainted with.
Oh yes.
Yes. Thank you. I mean, I'm trying to find the best words to describe how I feel about having the privilege of actually interview you. So I'll just leave it at that. Your words speak for themselves. There we are. I can't do better than that, can I?
Well, thank you for the opening, and I hope only good can come of it.
And we are back. That was quite an interview. I'm really pleased that we've finally had Mr. Churton on the show. What did you think, Mr. Satyr?
Well, it's a fascinating subject. The character of Crowley is this fascinating sort of countercultural influence, which, as I said, sort of crops up in all sorts of very unexpected ways, very sort of relative ways as well. And Mr. Churton himself is a fascinating character and just the right person, for the work. I mean, it seems providential almost that he's actually being able to sort of apply himself to this particular work. And then, and there's, I think, some people might think, oh God, not another, yet another book on Crowley, and some wag might say, oh well, it's like, Tobias might write, Crowley in his bath or something like that. But I'll tell you what, a writer who's capable of bringing that sort of concentrated sort of focus and a new light and a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, those books to the serious student would be of great value.
Yeah, exactly. And we were speaking earlier about it's the kind of great passion he brings to the subject as well when talking about it, and that was absolutely fantastic. It was and
he has strong feelings and views and things, and he's not squeamish about expressing them, and that's refreshing in and of itself, I think, irrespective of how much you may feel sympathetic to it or not. Also, it's in line, it's in step with the sort of Crowley ethos or meme.
No, definitely. Now we have a third copy of Aleister Crowley in England to give away to a listener, and I'm actually going to make you go to the website to find the question. It's going to be a competition. There will be a question on the post at sittingnow.co.uk. I will run this competition from the beginning of January till the end of January, so you have time to get yourself over. I mean, there's no excuse. We all have phones with the internet on these days, so don't give me the excuse that you can't get to a computer. So go to sittingnow.co.uk, look for the post. It's episode 60. There's a whole section at the top of the site that allows you to select which episode. So it's episode 60. Come to the site, look for the competition question. I will only publish it on the website, so you have to come to the website. Not that I'm trying to get traffic or anything so obvious, but it's just yes, I just want people to come and have a look at the website. So yes, we will be giving away that spare copy to the first person. Maybe not the first, but we'll do a lucky dip. So get your question in, and we'll find some way of randomising the selection process, and the lucky winner will get a brand new hardback copy of Tobias Churton's new book, Aleister Crowley in England, The Return of the Great Beast, and it's a fantastic book.
It's a very worthwhile book, and it's a like I say, an intriguing and fascinating subject matter. I mean, we touch on it in the interview, but the tone was set in sort of 1951 with the first biography written about Crowley, which sort of set the tone, unfortunately, in some respects. But 1951 was it was another planet, and you can see how Crowley, as a pioneering figure, caused anxieties, which at the time, which people now, in some respects, anyways, wouldn't share.
No, true.
Wouldn't necessarily share.
Anyway, we will be back next week. We have the author Marck Satyr on the show, and we're going to be talking to him about egregores, his book. He actually has a new book out as well, but we're actually going to talk to him first about egregores, and then have him back on to talk about his more recent book, which is about Masons. But anyway, until then, we will see you next week, and sleep well.
you.